Thank you all for being here, and thank you for joining us for the talk at 1 o'clock. We're really excited to hear from you. I just wanted to say that the Peace Center, we just celebrated, if you don't know, last year our 50th anniversary as an organization. And as we look back at the 50 years and as we look forward to our next 50 years, one of our big focuses and something I want to focus on is getting a lot more youth involved in what we're doing. And as well as kind of building an intergenerational coalition, I guess, in our community, because we had success with that in the past, and just know that there's so much that we, the younger generation, even younger than myself, students can learn from the older generation, and vice versa. So I'm really grateful for this connection with the Friends of the Peace Center, because I feel like it bridges that gap for the intergenerational organizing to happen. The pandemic has definitely affected the center, but we've switched to webinar style kind of events like this. And our next focus is to do local candidate forums in Concord, working with local organizations to do interview candidates for city council on climate-based issues. So that'll be happening in October. And moving forward into the fall, we're just gonna look to support folks during the election season, and then try to pray for some good results in November and have a lot of work to do regardless from there. But again, really thankful for Rick, Sarah, and everyone involved with the Friends of the Mount Diablo Peace Center group for kind of bridging this connection and bringing people like you here to speak. So that's about it, but thank you for letting me kind of say that.
Well, yeah, it's great to have you with us, Andrew.
Sure.
I should mention, of course, today is November, or is 9/11. It's the 19th anniversary of the events of 9/11. And I thought it would be educational to hear from two authors who have studied the situation in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and beyond, and what the relation is between those events, and 9/11 and today. We're very happy that Paul and Liz are able to join us. They came to the Peace Center 9 or 10 years ago, actually. Perhaps I think it was regarding their book tour that they did following the release of their first book, Afghanistan's Untold Story. And Noam Chomsky wrote of that book, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story is a critically important contribution to our understanding of some of the most dramatic and significant developments of current history. There are a number of references and praising the book, and I'm happy to say that I've had it on the shelf for a few years, and I'm finally starting to read it, prompted by the presentation today. They've written another book that follows on that, and that book is called Crossing Zero, the AfPak War at the Turning Point of the American Empire. And I've also started reading that book, and it is also extremely important and interesting and actually quite significant. Selig Harrison describes it this way: Crossing Zero is much more than a devastating indictment of the folly of US military intervention in Afghanistan. Fitzgerald and Gould demonstrate that the US debacle in Afghanistan is the predictable climax of US imperial overreach on a global scale. Like their earlier work documenting the origins of US involvement in Afghanistan, Crossing Zero deserves the attention of all serious students of US foreign policy. So there's many references to the book, Daniel Ellsberg, Stephen Kinzer, Julianne Marcel. A lot of very, very knowledgeable writers and experts have a very high praise for the book. So I encourage people who are interested in US foreign policy to look up these books. So I think we'll have time. Basically, Paul and Liz are going to talk for 30 or 35 minutes approximately. And we'll have, we're thinking to have 10 or 15 minutes for questions afterward. We're going to suggest that people type up their question in the chat box at the end of the presentation. And maybe, you know, I think we might find out a little bit more about Paul and Liz afterwards in the Q&A if it doesn't come up in their talk. So with that, I'd like to welcome Paul and Liz and say how happy we are to have them with us today on this very significant day. And we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we would both like to thank you for this second invitation to speak to you. It's a pleasure to be here. Of course, this is a little different than the last time, needless to say. But, you know, in order to, I think what I'm going to do is basically, I'm going to go back to the beginning, how we actually got into the story itself. We have to go before, okay, the actual Soviet invasion. We were very involved. This would have been in 1977. Jimmy Carter gets elected basically on a peace platform, okay? It was a time when the Vietnam War had come to an end. There was a devastated civilian economy that had been ravaged by the war economy. And it was really important that there be reinvestment in the civilian economy. And there was a movement, the détente movement, to have better relations with the Soviet Union. And there was also the SALT Treaty, which had gone through 3 administrations by that point. And it was a process of trying to negotiate less weapons to be developed. And it became critically important after Vietnam because of the devastation of the American economy. So we got involved, would have been probably in the summer of 1977 after Jimmy Carter gets elected, pretty much on a peace mandate, okay? And we were doing a documentary about the SALT process and the détente process. And we ended up interviewing people like Paul Warnke, who was the SALT negotiator, and John Kenneth Galbraith, who was a very big supporter of the SALT process and was trying very hard to help people understand why it was so important at an economic level that we needed SALT and we needed détente. And so this is now in the summer of 1979, and December 27th, 1979, the Soviet Union crosses the border into Afghanistan. And from our perspective, it seemed as if the entire SALT, détente, peace movement collapsed. It literally evaporated. And President Carter gets on national television and announces that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is the greatest threat to peace since World War II. Okay, and we didn't know an awful lot at that moment about Afghanistan, but we knew it was not a very important part of American strategic thinking. And we found Carter's phrasing and also the speed with which he presented this description to just not feel right. So the more we started noticing the way the mainstream media was framing the story, the way that they were coming out, and also because we were working with all these key people on the SALT process and in our documentary, we realized that it almost felt as if the whole thing had been scripted, that it couldn't possibly have happened, it wasn't spontaneous. So that was our first initiation into a sense that something is not right with this story. Okay, and when we finally got the visa to get into Afghanistan, which was in May of 1981, we went in for CBS News. That's when we were confirmed very quickly that the stories coming out on American television, mainstream media television, did not match what was going on in the streets of Kabul. There was a very small Soviet presence. There was clearly what they were referring to as Russia's Vietnam. There was no sign of Russia's Vietnam, certainly in the sense of the Saigon nightmare that was, that was a metaphor from. And so we come back with that story for CBS, who basically makes it very clear that's not the story they wanted. They really wanted Russia's Vietnam. And they actually spent about a month trying to figure out what to do with the footage, which showed over and over again that it wasn't Russia's Vietnam, at least to the degree of what, you know, what was in the, what was shot in Kabul and what was shown by the authorities while the filming was going on. And it wasn't as if we had the whole story, but we certainly had a challenge. But the other part that was obvious was that the people in Kabul, the actual Afghans who were not all communists, many of the Afghans were in all kinds of different affiliations, but they definitely were being attacked from Pakistan. And this was the biggest complaint that, you know, we could bring back, the voice of the Afghan people, that there were provocations coming from Pakistan. And Pakistan at this point is actually a US ally, okay? And as opposed to Afghanistan, who was really kind of ignored and almost pushed in the direction of Soviet sphere of influence position. So that was, you know, all part of why Carter's reaction to this did not make sense. So we bring this story back. CBS does a kind of non-story about what we didn't see. Okay, well, about a year later, we developed a documentary for PBS. And this is actually, again, what I'm giving you are bits of the experience that really opened our eye to what we refer to as the magical thinking process. Magical thinking being literally creating whatever you want for your narrative, and the facts don't matter. That's what magical thinking is, okay? So that's what we were really beginning to witness, was the framing of the Afghan narrative from that perspective, okay? And CBS made it clear that we didn't have the images they wanted, so they had to come up with something, and it had nothing to do with what we had actually seen. So the next experience is doing the PBS documentary, and that's when we receive a phone call from a Major Karen McKay, who represents one of the freedom fighter Afghan groups. And she calls to complain to us that we didn't have anything in the documentary about the Soviets using chemicals in their war. So we mentioned that there hasn't been a whole lot of proof. And she says, well, I've shown my proof to the Washington Post and to the New York Times. They say, but it's all secondhand and third hand. There's no actual hard evidence. Don't you think you'd make a better case if you actually presented hard evidence? And her statement back to us was, we don't need evidence when it comes to the Soviets. We don't need proof. They're guilty. So this attitude, literally, you know, there was no restraint in trying to even hide it. It was right out. We don't need facts. We don't need proof. So this was another one of those, wow, I'm more startled that she was so willing to state it without any hesitation at all. So these are the kinds of things that are coming along. Well, our next adventure with mainstream media and the narrative creation process is our second trip to Afghanistan is with Roger Fisher from the Harvard Negotiation Project. We had asked him to come to Afghanistan to see if he couldn't help spur a negotiated settlement. And before we left on this trip, we were sent a news article that actually was about a news story that had been on CBS News weeks before. And it was the editor we worked with at CBS who was quoted as saying that they were very excited because now they had footage that showed it was Russia's Vietnam. And they had 3 nights of Dan Rather report showing Soviets all over Kabul, military equipment all over Kabul, and Dan Rather delightedly labeled it Russia's Vietnam, which was the sort of the working metaphor that had been actually created before the Soviets actually crossed into Afghanistan. So we were surprised. We obviously we were actually going to be leaving for Kabul within a few weeks. So we said, wow, that's a piece of news. Well, we leave for Kabul with Roger, who actually had already been in touch with Soviet officials the year before who had asked him to help them get out of Afghanistan. So we were going with the attitude that we had a real possibility of a negotiated settlement. But it was very disturbing to consider that the Soviets had actually increased their presence to the level that had been presented on CBS News. So we get to Kabul, and it turns out there's no Soviet presence. It's actually less of a Soviet presence than there was in 1981. This is 1983. So we do our trip. Roger goes to the Soviet embassy. The Soviets send down their top official, personally to meet with Roger to tell him, we want to get out of Afghanistan. Please help us, basically. We'll do, you know, we'll figure it out. Okay, so this is what we're beginning to wonder. What is going on? There's no Soviets. The Afghans are clearly, I mean, the Soviets are clearly making it obvious they really would like assistance to get out. And again, you know, the Soviet presence was almost non-existent. Okay, so the day before we're supposed to leave, go back to New York this was for Nightline. We end up going to a dinner at the embassy. There's a weekly dinner, and a lot of the local people are invited. And one of the people that happened to be invited was a couple from the Quaker Mission. And we mentioned to them that there was a report on CBS about troops all over the place that was filmed by this man named Eric Dershmead. And it was on CBS News. So we asked him, what's going on? He's, oh, I remember Dershmead was here. One of the two said to us. He was waiting for the Soviet troop rotation to come through. It took a number of weeks. Apparently, the Soviets, it was known that the Soviets have a troop rotation once a year in March when the snow melts. And what Dershmead did was he waited until the troop rotation was in Kabul, and he said it causes a huge traffic jam. And that's the film that CBS used and claimed it proved it was Russia's Vietnam. It doesn't get more blatant than that, okay? So when we went back, we actually spoke with Peter Larkin, who was the foreign editor who actually, you know, put this piece of information out. And he was very quiet on the phone when we mentioned, we found out that the Soviet troop rotation happened. But needless to say, that really didn't change anything in terms of that narrative creation process that we're beginning to see building and building and building. And this would have been, I guess I said, this was 1983. When we get back to New York, to ABC, after the encounter with the mission telling us that this was a Soviet rotation, we're clearly greeted with a kind of attitude at ABC Nightline that, you know, was definitely not encouraging. It turns out that Ted Koppel, who was the host of Nightline at the time, the guest that they invited on was a Russian dissident instead of officials from, you know, officials who could actually analyze the possibility of a negotiated settlement, American officials certainly. A Soviet dissident gets on and puts out the unsubstantiated claim that the Soviets are never going to leave because they want the Persian Gulf oil. That was one of the mantras of the dissidents, you know, and of course, this was a Soviet dissident. And it was also one of the mantras of a lot of the pro-Mujahideen Afghan supporters, that they simply claimed without any evidence that the Soviets would not leave because they wanted to get the Persian Gulf oil. So we realized once again that we were up against the complete control of the narrative already had happened, okay? And there was absolutely not one move towards Roger from any official from the United States or any other mainstream to try and promote this possibility, which was very real. So this is 1983. And of course, by 1984, 85, you begin to see the rise of Charlie Wilson, who we all know eventually became very important and very well known because of the book written about him called Charlie Wilson's War. So this is where, this would have been in about 1987, when we're looking at this narrative creation process and realizing that you can't approach this problem with more facts because they've already made it clear they don't care if you bring in facts that contradict what the narrative is that they want to put out. So we really had to kind of go in another direction, and we ended up writing screenplays and eventually ended up with Oliver Stone asking us to write a screenplay about our journalistic adventure in Afghanistan. And we spent 3 years discovering the limitations of Hollywood. But I'd like to make this note that when it did come to the only major film that Hollywood made about Afghanistan and the US role in Afghanistan was Charlie Wilson's War, which is actually should be better viewed as a piece of propaganda. Okay, that was the propaganda story, the way it was framed and the way it was set up. So this is, you know, where you reach a point and you sort of don't you don't know what to do. And of course, at that point, we decided that we started to write books and look into things in a new way. And in 1998, Zbigniew Brzezinski does something that's rather amazing, okay, in terms of an official who was very involved in the whole drawing the Soviets into Afghanistan. He goes on a public record and basically boasts about the fact that he intentionally tricked the Soviets into Afghanistan, and Carter signed a directive allowing him to do certain things at least 6 months before the Soviet invasion. That became a really important piece of absolutely powerful evidence, because even though there was a lot of other evidence, this was really amazing, because this is the actual official who did the deed, who actually did it. And I think under the right circumstances, with the right state of mind, what Brzezinski did could be considered a war crime. He not only drew the Soviets into something they never would have gone into had it not been for what he did, but he also guaranteed the destruction of Afghanistan. So we've really got some serious crimes here as a result of what he claimed. And once again, there was not one single attempt on the part of the administration or any of the officials to actually verify and actually investigate what Brzezinski had claimed. In fact, a lot of the insiders pretty much tried to claim, oh, it's just a boast. Brzezinski just boasts about things like that. So that kind of led us eventually, of course, 9/11 happens. And that's when a lot of people finally said, oh, listen, Paul, you were right. Afghanistan is important. So we ended up, really getting more back into the real background, the resource material. And of course, by that point, a lot of material had been declassified. So by 2009, we finally had finished our first book on Afghanistan, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story. So what we did at that point, of course, we did a book tour. I think we might have come to you at one of those events, might have been yours. And we did one. This would have been at Harvard Square. And one of the people that arrives at our book event is Charles Kogan. Charles Kogan is the chief. He is the CIA's chief of the Directorate of Operations for South Central
Near East.
Near East. Long time.
Near East and South Central Asia.
Asia. Okay. Division. I think that's in it too. All right. He's a pretty high level guy. He was teaching at Harvard at the time. And he came to our event, and at the end of the presentation, he gets up to the mic, he introduces himself, full title, everything, and he says, what these people have just told you about—
In the interest of full disclosure.
In the interest of full disclosure, right? What these people have told you about the way the Soviets ended up in Afghanistan is basically authentic. But I will argue with you about Brzezinski tricking the Soviets into Afghanistan. And I bring up that story, and this is a story that Paul will complete, because it's another piece of the equation with Charles Kogan that's part of our story. And now I'm going to turn it over to Paul, who's going to get more into the inner workings behind Brzezinski and Carter and how that really inaugurated this whole nightmare that we're now seeing today.
Well, thank you, Liz. It was very well done. It's almost like I was there myself listening to it. The whole Afghan issue is really an illustration of the way covert programs work and have worked in our government since the end of World War II, through the Cold War, and now, I'm afraid, unfortunately, still working. At the time it was viewed, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was played out by members of the US government as a completely unprovoked incident of aggression. Example of aggression by the Soviet Empire, and was therefore a justification for a massive rearmament that America had been planning, that the United States, the right wing in this country, the Reagan administration, the conservatives had been planning. The Carter administration, unbeknownst to most people, was actually in the process of already changing things. From the moment they got in 1977, they were doing all kinds of changes. And that's what I want to talk about today, is about the influence of Zbigniew Brzezinski, because the only way you can really understand where we are today is to go back to 1979 and 1980 and understand how, actually go back to 1977, when Brzezinski and Carter went into the White House to actually make some fundamental changes in the way the United States, to end détente and end SALT II, and make some fundamental changes about the way the United States actually behaved towards the Soviet Union, which set the stage for the Reagan administration. So the best way to understand it is to look back at this time period and understand that Brzezinski impacted the future, the world we're living in today, in ways that people just really don't fully appreciate. And I didn't even fully appreciate until I started digging into some of the background behind this. According to numerous studies, he transformed the role of the National Security Advisor. You had, in terms of the way the government is divided up, the president basically controls the CIA through his National Security Advisor. And that was a result of that. The CIA was under the control of the State Department prior to the time of Jimmy Carter's presidency. And so that was a fundamental change that occurred. And that actually occurred on St. Simon Island with Jimmy Carter, meetings he had with Brzezinski and the staff of the National Security Council during that time period before they even assumed power in the White House in January of 1977. And what they did was, what Carter wanted to, he told Brzezinski he didn't want to duplicate what had happened in the Nixon administration to recreate a kind of czar, intelligence czar in Henry Kissinger, and have him ruling all the decisions that were being made about American foreign policy. So he asked Brzezinski to come in and redesign the power structure, redesign the chain of command from top to bottom. And so ironically, what Brzezinski winds up doing is creating two separate committees. One committee is basically deals with all the various heads of the departments and all the various cabinet people. And the other one is basically in charge of all the important things that go on. And that all the other ones are going to be run by the department heads and by the various people in the departments who are in charge. And then the other one, the SCC, the Special Communications Committee, is going to be run by Brzezinski. So then he goes in, they go into the White House, and it turns out that all the important things have to go across Brzezinski's desk. And then Brzezinski presents them to Carter. And what Carter does is he elevates it to a cabinet level position. The National Security Advisor had not been cabinet level. So now he's equal to the State Department, he's equal to the Secretary of State. So that's a fundamental change in the way the government works. It grants an enormous amount of power to Brzezinski. And so from that moment on, everything starts to change. So based on a number of studies that have been done, once he took control, he starts shutting off access to President Carter from Cyrus Vance, from the CIA director, Stansfield Turner, from everybody and anybody who has a different opinion from Brzezinski. Naked, absolutely naked destruction of the process. And this goes on and on. So he starts out in January of 1977. So by the summer of 1978, he's got full control of the situation, but not entirely full control. He's still battling with Cyrus Vance. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to set it up so that there's a complete acceptance of China, of the People's Republic of China as an ally to the United States, against the interests of détente and the Soviet Union, and against the prevailing policy at the State Department. So what happens is that we have this individual by the name of Adolph Spike Dubs, who was a career diplomat, very seasoned. He'd been in Moscow for the State Department. He'd been at the embassy during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. He knows his way around. He speaks Russian, he speaks German, he speaks French. He's a very clever guy. And he is sent as the next ambassador to Afghanistan, and arrives in July of 1978, right as Brzezinski is pushing this entire agenda onto the Carter administration to shift the focus away from the Soviet Union to China. And this was supposedly not known to President Carter. Carter supposedly, one of the most best statements on this thing was done by a guy by the name of Ray Gartzoff. He wrote a very astute history. It's like 5,000 page history of this time period. And he basically keeps apologizing for Brzezinski doing things that Carter didn't really understand, or he didn't know, or he was misled, or he unintentionally misled the president during this time period. At any rate, what happens is that this guy from the State Department, this new ambassador to Afghanistan, Adolf Dubs, goes in with the intention of basically neutralizing the destabilization process that had been going on inside Afghanistan and sparked by Brzezinski from early 1977. So he gets there, and Selig Harrison, this person that you quoted who reviewed our books, he was at the Washington Post at the time, and he went in, actually in August of 1978, sat down with him. And we had sat down when we were trying to put this movie together for Oliver Stone. We actually went to Washington and we sat down with Sig Harrison, and he gave us the whole lowdown. He said, I was in there. He says, I sat down with him, and he said he had this whole plan. He said to go and get the leadership in Kabul, which was nominally Marxist, but they really were actually more nationalist than Marxist. It was a big question mark. And the United States had never really considered Afghanistan to be on the American side anyway, because they bordered the Soviet Union and they had a military alliance with them. And the United States had Pakistan next door, so they really didn't, they were basically too much trouble if you look back into the 1950s. So anyway, he went in there and he said, this guy, Adolf Dubs, really wanted to bring the leader, Hafizullah Amin, over to the American side, but he had to do it very carefully. He had to do it very, very strategically so that the Soviets wouldn't get upset. And Dubs had this ability because he knew the Soviets well. He'd been at the Moscow embassy through this crisis in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so he really felt as if he could make some headway for the State Department in maintaining detente and getting SALT II passed and doing all those other things that Jimmy Carter had promised to do. Well, he gets in there, and the next thing he knows, he's beset and besieged by Brzezinski's people, who are basically making trouble everywhere he goes. And so February 14th, 1979, now remember, Iran next door goes down, the Shah goes down, I think January 29th or something, about 2 or 3 weeks before. He gets in there and he's on his way to work, and he gets kidnapped on his way to work and brought to the Kabul Hotel. This is the American ambassador, gets brought to the Kabul Hotel in downtown Kabul and held hostage by 3 kidnappers. It's not exactly sure. It gets very vague. Everybody's got a different story about how it happened. So at any rate, the Kabul government is unreachable. High level of the Kabul government is unreachable during the negotiations. The US Embassy sues, Cyrus Vance sues for peace. Don't do anything rash, don't rush the room, make sure that he doesn't get killed. The Soviets who are there advising the Afghans say, of course, we will never do anything like that. And so what happens is that all of a sudden, around noontime, he's kidnapped around 9 o'clock, around 3 hours later, the police decide to rush the room. They storm the room. There's a barrage from outside the room. There's a barrage from the hallway. They go in, and before they go in, the Kabul police chief goes in on his own into the room after the barrage. 4 shots are heard being fired. He then comes out and waves the rest of the Americans in with the stretcher to come in and pick up the ambassador. Well, needless to say, the ambassador had been shot many times by the barrage that had happened from the outside and from the hallway. But he had 4 bullet holes in his head from a .22 caliber weapon, small weapon. The kidnappers apparently did not have .22 caliber weapons. So it would appear that the US ambassador was killed by the Kabul police chief. The question then remains, why? Now, this is when Brzezinski jumps on the assassination as evidence that the Afghans did not want America's influence there, that the Soviets were involved and influenced the Afghans to help out in this assassination of the American ambassador. And the fact is that the Afghans who had taken over the government at that point weren't very good at the diplomatic aspects of what their jobs really were. So they fumbled a few things. They sent a letter of apology through commercial channels instead of diplomatic channels. It didn't come. If you look at the secret cables that was secret at the time, They basically, the American government says, we can officially ignore the fact that it came through commercial channels because it's not official. It didn't come in officially. So that Brzezinski and his people jump on the assassination as an opportunity to move the destabilization of Afghanistan even further up the scale. And there's another incident a few months later whereby the rebels finally proved that they can actually do something. It was in one of the cities in Afghanistan. They actually staged an effort to overthrow the local Marxist government in Herat. And so as a result of that, from that moment on, Cyrus Vance lost control of the policy as it regarded the Soviet Union, as it regarded Afghanistan. And so this is what happened. So the issue, we know what happened in 1979. So in the summer of 1979, it comes out, Dr. Charles Kogan, the man who showed up that Liz talked about, showed up at our event and was constantly going around to various places where people were talking about this incident. He and, who was it, the other guy? The guy, the head of the CIA, Gates, Robert Gates, in his book in 1996 came out and said that a secret program had been initiated in the summer of 1979. And so Brzezinski, when Brzezinski heard about it, he did an interview in the Nouvel Observateur, the French newspaper, and said that, yeah, he thought that was a great idea. He said we had the opportunity to lure them into the Afghan trap. Well, needless to say, Brzezinski's admission that it was an Afghan trap, that they had done it intentionally, completely blew the CIA's whole cover story and the US government's cover story that the Soviet invasion was an act of naked aggression, unprovoked. Brzezinski's position, his ideological position, he and Richard Pipes had been up to that point, was that the Soviets were on their way to the Persian Gulf. The CIA had done a story, a bogus study, apparently 2 years earlier, that said that the Soviets were running out of oil. So here it was, all the pieces just kind of fit together, and they said, well, this is it. They're on their way to the Persian Gulf. We need that massive defense buildup that we've been planning on. And so it changed everything. It put American forces in the Middle East. The strategic, one of the special rapid deployment forces was ordered into the Middle East to defend our interests in the Middle East. And it was done without any objection by from the Arab countries because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So the narrative was just run almost constantly. And that's what the narrative continued through the publication of Charlie Wilson's War and the making of the movie and the fabrication of all kinds of things that didn't really happen. So at any rate, this goes on and on and on until 2015. We decided that we were going to go back and we were going to talk to Charles Kogan and get some of these things on the record for him. So we brought the cameraman that we'd taken to Afghanistan with us in 1981. He agreed to come with us over to Cambridge, and we went over to Charles Kogan's apartment, and he was very gracious receiving us, and very dapper gentleman with the mustache and the whole deal. And I think he was in his late 70s or early 80s. He was in his 80s by this point. And he said, we start the interview, and we go for about 15 minutes, and he says, can I tell you a story? And I said, please tell me a story. He said, you know, Samuel Huntington, who was a member of the National Security Staff under Brzezinski, passed away. And he said they had a memorial service for him at Harvard. And he said, I'd never met Brzezinski in person. So I went over to see him. And he said, I went up to him and he says, you know, I really think that the things that you've done since the collapse of the Soviet Union have been quite remarkable. You know, you really you've modified things in many ways. He said, but this whole business about what you said about provoking the Soviets intentionally to invade in 1979, he says, he says, that isn't true, is it? And Brzezinski said, yeah, it is true. I actually did do it. It was intentional. We were doing things over at the White House and the National Security Council that you weren't aware of over at the CIA. He said, but yeah, he said, that was what we did. And so for Kogan to hear that was a revelation, not just for Kogan, but the fact that you have to come to realize that this is a very good example of how compartmentalized and how sealed tight the government really is. And you hear about leaks here and about leaks there. But this was a case where the chief of the Directorate of Operations for the Near East and South Central Asia, who ran the Mujahideen Afghan War from 1979 to 1984, actually didn't know that it had been done intentionally by Carter's National Security Advisor and approved by the president, by Jimmy Carter. So here we are. So this is the myth of the so-called, what is academically now cycles as the myth of the Afghan trap. Charles Kogan has now debunked the myth, but academics are still writing about it. A few months ago, an article appeared, and we were sent the article by a friend of ours who works as a professor at Northeastern University, and she said, "I don't understand this. You may need to respond to this." And it was written by this guy what is it?
Dublin.
What's the name of the college? University College Dublin. But it was published in an Oxford University publication on foreign affairs. And he basically insists that the whole business about Brzezinski intentionally luring the Soviets into the Afghan trap based on this Novella Observateur article, which is the issue, is basically there's no basis in fact. He goes through all these gyrations to go in and out of all these various publications that have been made over the years, and the fact that Brzezinski denied it, and then he really said that no, he never really did do it, and all these other people coming forward saying, oh no, we didn't intentionally do that. It's a misunderstanding, it's a mistranslation, whatever. So at any rate, we found it. We contacted the guy and who wrote the article. Connor Tobin is the guy's name, and he sent us the article, and it is absolutely amazing. It's like watching a Walt Disney movie.
It's magical thinking.
It's magical thinking. It's like watching a Walt Disney movie of Afghanistan and what was done. He basically relies on all the things that all the official records that are recorded. But the fact is that if you look at them, some of these things have been recorded in this thing, Official Records Department, FRUS, I believe it's called, Federal Records. And it's online, and you can read them. And you can see for a fact that in there are a lot of specific cables that are missing. Now, this guy, John Helmer, regarding this particular incident, this guy, John Helmer, who was tasked during the Carter White House with going into the administration, into the Carter administration, and wound up basically giving a kind of overview of what was going on. He was tasked with looking at some of the things that they were doing. According to John Helmer, an NSC staffer who was tasked with investigating two of Brzezinski's policy recommendations to Carter, wrote in 2017, Brzezinski would risk anything to undermine the Soviets, and his operations in Afghanistan were well known. Brzezinski was an obsessive Russia hater to the end. That led to the monumental failures of Carter's term in office. The hatreds Brzezinski released had an impact which continues to be catastrophic for the rest of the world, he wrote in a 2017 blog post. To Brzezinski goes the credit for starting most of the ills, the organization, financing, and armament of the Mujahideen, the Islamic fundamentalists who have metastasized with US money and arms still into Islamic terrorist armies operating far from Afghanistan and Pakistan, where Brzezinski started them off. Helmer insists that Brzezinski exercised an almost hypnotic power over Carter that bent him toward Brzezinski's ideological agenda while blinding him to the consequences from the outset of his presidency. Quote, from the start, in the first 6 months of 1977, Carter was warned explicitly by his own staff inside the White House not to allow Brzezinski to dominate policymaking to the exclusion of all other advice and the erasure, I emphasize that, erasure of the evidence on which the advice was based. Yet the warning fell on deaf ears. So people have been living under the illusion since the Carter administration that he was one of the few good guys that were in there. He was trying to make the transition from the Nixon era, the Nixon-Ford era, and all the mistakes of the Vietnam era into a new existence for the United States. And it turns out he was allowing Brzezinski to do the most heinous things, which set in mind, and even Brzezinski, by the time he retired, by the time he,
2016.
by the time what?
Well, by 2016.
By 2016, by the time he passed away, well, he passed away in 2017. By the time 2016, he came out and said, it's time to end this. We really can't do it. He didn't intend. He intended to defeat the Soviet Union. He didn't intend to bring this clique of people into the White House and embed them in the infrastructure, so that now the State Department, the CIA, the White House, the National Security Council, all of the various intelligence services basically you to an ideological point of view, not the facts. Facts are no longer important to the United States government, and we can see that, unfortunately, on 9/11. What happened on 9/11, no matter what you come out with to try to debunk what they're doing or what they're saying is the official narrative, you wind up coming up against a blank wall.
But that final thing.
So at any rate, the final thing?
About Afghanistan and opium.
Oh, and opium. Well, the other thing about this is that why are we still there? I think that comes down to the final issue. Thank you for reminding me of that. The issue regarding Afghanistan, and it also involves some of the people who were there at the very beginning of American involvement, is the fact that Afghanistan has become the world's largest supplier of heroin. 90% of the world's heroin comes from Afghanistan, the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Now, what's interesting, if you look back at the time period and you compare what was going on, I don't know how many people have seen the Denzel Washington movie, American Gangster. It was out about 10 years ago or so. And it's about how black gangsters from Harlem wound up bringing in opium and heroin directly from the Golden Triangle, which was Burma, Laos, and Thailand. Okay, this is back during the Vietnam War. They developed a sophisticated trafficking network where they shipped the heroin in the pallets that the caskets were coming back from American GIs who had been killed over there. Big scandal at the time, but it took the federal government about 5 or 6 years. They started doing it in the 60s. It didn't take, they weren't actually arrested until 1975. So the fact is that one of the things they deal with in the movie is the fact that they have to go and they have to get this last shipment out of the triangle before the United States leaves in 1973. So, but 1972, 73, it was obvious that the United States was going to be leaving that area, and the U.S. military wasn't going to be protecting the drug trafficking anymore at any length anymore. So CIA was heavily involved in it. So what they did was there's a couple of books that were written at the time about how that was going to be transferred to South Central Asia, Southwest Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan border, and it was exactly the right place for that to happen for them, for the drug dealers and for the international narcotics industry. And so that's what happened. The man who was put in charge of that in Pakistan, a guy by the name of Fazl Haq, was the governor and a lieutenant general in the Pakistani service, army. And he's the guy who supposedly recommended to Brzezinski to turn Afghanistan into Russia's Vietnam. Well, he went on to basically build up inside Pakistan, to build up the drug running networks. A bank was called the BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which was basically running an enormous $25 billion racket of smuggling drugs in to the United States, into Europe, and smuggling weapons into the Mujahideen. So that was an enormous scandal that began. It's not talked about. That industry has now become the largest drug industry in the world. It's being overseen by the U.S. military. And
well, I think the important thing about the question I know everybody wants to know is, are we really going to ever leave Afghanistan? And I would have to say that not with that 90% of the drug trade coming out of there, I don't see it. But even if they leave, I think you need to also realize that privatized military can also do the same job. So what we're really looking at, I think, is the underlying process that really has a lot to do. When they talk about how oil is important, well, guess what? The drugs are a separate agenda of importance. And what we have seen is the rise of the Afghan heroin trade is a direct relationship to the demise of the trade from the Golden Triangle to the Golden Crescent. And that and that's part of the reason that the difficulty of the U.S. leaving. When you're talking about the amount of money that the drugs provide, in 2008 there was some kind of report claiming that the drug trade was saving the U.S. economy. So this is part of the reality that is never factored into why things happen a certain way. And when it comes to Afghanistan, I would have to say the chances are that the U.S. is not going to leave unless there is a collapse of some kind in the U.S.
So I'm sure you have no questions based on what we just said.
Well, thank you very much. And I would encourage viewers to ask their questions in the chat box if you can.
Can you see it?
I think so. I mean, I don't know where it is.
It should come up.
Okay, yeah. There it is.
This chat right here.
Well, maybe I've got one to start off. Is what do you think about what are the connections between those events in the late 1970s and 9/11 and Osama bin Laden? Do you think there's any connection at all?
Oh, absolutely. I think you can draw a straight line from the CIA buildup in the summer of 1979. From the start of this CIA project, it just grew. There were a number of different agendas. We had the drug agenda. That was one major agenda. You have the oil agenda. The Saudis were more than happy to step in where the CIA couldn't go because they were basically interested in spreading their religion, the Wahhabist version of Islam, a radical Islam, to create a kind of pan-Islamic corridor up to Europe and up to into Central Asia. That was another thing. But they also, of course, were the oil industry. They're in the oil business. That's where they make all their money. Their only place where they make their money. And that's what they wanted to do. And when the Taliban finally gave up in 1996, that was when even before that, when the Taliban were taking over, there was a big effort to try to get an oil deal. Delta Oil, I believe, was one of the companies. Bridas was one of the companies. An Argentinian company went in to try to make a deal so that they get the pipelines. Afghanistan is centrally located in South Central Asia. An Afghan once told us it was the belly button of Asia. And so, in that sense, it was on the old Silk Road. It's been an ancient trading center. You go from the Middle East to Europe into Asia and back again. It's just an incredible place. And before the war, before this all started happening, it used to be referred to as the Paris of Central Asia. It was a wonderful place to visit.
Well, that actually is part of the great tragedy that is most disturbing about what happened to Afghanistan, was that it was actually a relatively moderate form of Islam that Afghans practiced. They were very tolerant. Historically, the country was known as being very friendly and inviting. The Silk Road went through, and there was constant flows back and forth of all kinds of people. And there's historical records from, from Westerners who ended up in Afghanistan and were treated beautifully and accepted, and the hospitality was world renowned. What happened to the Afghan people, I think, is very, it's for us, it's the sort of the great, crisis that people today think that Afghanistan is kind of the way it was, that it wasn't much better than that. And that is, I think, the greatest tragedy the Afghan people probably have to suffer with, is that what now has taken over is basically the Wahhabists. I mean, the spread of the Wahhabism, which it was, of course, what the Saudis did. It's what the Mujahideen were really about. They were really spreading the Wahhabism, and they broke the traditional hold on Afghanistan of the moderates and the Islam, the moderate Islamic approach. And the country had been secular, and women had the right to vote, and there were, women were allowed to wear all kinds of different
very
clothing.
Progressive, and for a long time. 19th century, they began a very progressive government efforts to educate women and remove them from the veil and the whole thing. We have a question. Could you talk about who's been running U.S. foreign policy under Trump? Josiah Borishis. We know Josiah. Good question. It's the same people who were there. Actually, Zalmay Khalilzad is the Trump's representatives to the Taliban. And Zalmay Khalilzad is an Afghan himself who was very instrumental in screwing it up. When the king came back, he did not want the king back after 9/11. He did not want the king participating in the government. The only unifying force inside the government would to create an Afghan government would have been the return of the king, even in a symbolic fashion. And Zalmay Khalilzad insisted that that couldn't happen.
It was worse than that. They actually reinstalled the Mujahideen, the warlords who had been criminals. So the U.S. showed all along the way that they never intended Afghanistan to be rebuilt back to what it was in any way, shape, or form. And that was from the very beginning.
Now you have also, too, you had a situation where you had the Tajiks, who were an aspect and always felt they were a minority in Afghanistan. Tajikistan is just north of Afghanistan. But there were a lot of Tajiks in Afghanistan, but they were a minority population. And they always felt oppressed by the Pashtun majority, which lived in the eastern part of the country and on what used to be, what is now Pakistan, but what used to be part of Afghanistan in the 19th and prior centuries. So as a result of that, the United States went in and supported the Tajik faction. The Afghan National Army is basically a Tajik army, and the Taliban are basically Pashtuns. So we've watched over the last 10, 15 years, people saying, you know, if the US doesn't get the moderate Pashtuns on their side, it's going to fail. Well, it failed.
But
the Taliban are going to take over the Pashtun nationalist issue, which is what they've done. So now you've basically got the Tajiks warring against the Pashtuns, and the Tajiks are being supported by the United States, and that's all Zalmay Khalilzad's doing.
Yeah, to apparently make sure that Afghanistan never comes back together again.
Right.
I mean, sometimes you have to look at what looks like failure and chaos as when it keeps happening over and over, that was the purpose. And I'm very sad to say that that was exactly.
There was a guy who was connected to the CIA who told us when we first got involved in this whole business, he said, however it looks to you on the outside, just remember, it's always internally consistent.
Well, repeating what looks like failure over and over again, and as we said about, especially when it comes to Afghanistan, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that there was never an intent to rebuild Afghanistan. That was not the purpose.
I have another question. Ahmed Shah Massoud is known as the Lion of Panjshir and the Che Guevara of Afghanistan. He was assassinated by Osama bin Laden 2 days before 9/11. Was that part of the U.S. plan?
Well, he apparently had been showing signs that he wasn't going to be enough of a pan-Islamist. And the reason that's important, he was turning a little bit into a nationalist, and he was beginning to, show signs. And he had been more even out, he was one of the sort of the fighting the Soviets along with Gulbuddin. Okay, Gulbuddin never, he always stayed away and worked with the Pakistanis. But I think that Ahmed Shah Massoud began to, appear as if he might threaten the real purpose, which was to not have Afghanistan and to have it taken over by the pan-Islamists, which really suits the global ideal, where there's no national focus. It's all pan-Islamism.
You have to realize too that, like 78 and 79 and the struggle between Vance and Brzezinski over foreign policy, you have to realize that you're dealing with, in some cases, not a unified structure of opinion. You've got people who represent, certainly now, you have people who are bought and paid for their position on the National Security Council. You've got special interests that have lodged themselves in there. These aren't people who are necessarily even trained in any kind of diplomatic agenda or carrying any diplomatic agenda. They're basically in there representing corporate interests, oil interests, technology interests. There's all kinds of things going on. And I would assume at some point mafia interests, whose ever mafia they might be. So drug mafia interests. So you've got all kinds of lobbyists, and so there's no one particular group that can say, well, American policy is this. Well, American policy is a compromise between a number of rioting forces at this point. And it's reached with the Trump administration, between the Trump administration and the others, and as they refer to as the deep state. I think you've got a real schism. You've got a real potential here for a civil war inside not, I mean, the civil war is already there inside the corridors of government, and I think it's about ready to break out on the streets of America. Yes, we can. Any more questions?
I see someone.
Well, I think, can you hear me okay?
Yes,
yes,
fine.
Yeah, I'm having a little problem.
Yeah, a little,
In any case, I think we should, today was a great introduction. I highly recommend Paul and Liz's books, which, you know, are basically acclaimed by some and I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. And so maybe we'll just have one more question. Does Marilyn have a question?
There's no audio. Her audio is blocked.
Well, she... yeah, to type there. Let me see if I can find it. Is that Marilyn Bremser? We've got multiple Marylands.
Now you can hear me. A very blunt question, because you're so knowledgeable and spent so many years understanding Afghanistan. What do you think would happen should we both diplomatically and militarily pull out of Afghanistan in 2121?
well,
Well, I mean, the fact is that, you know, think of the end of ancient Rome. I mean, you know, they had to pull their legions out.
yeah,
You know, some of the legions had to basically go to work for the people they were living in with.
Yeah.
I recall there was a legion that was in China, I believe, and they wound up having to work for the Chinese emperor. So, you know, we have spent so much of our national resources on the military-industrial conflict since World War II. And so much of our thinking is even at this point governed by that. You know, if you look back, I remember speaking with people about the end of the British Empire. There's a lot of people who were, you know, one of the people we ran into in Kabul when we were there in 2002, his parents had been missionaries in China in the 1940s. And he said, you know, what was going on in Kabul in 2002 with the United States, he said, reminded him of what his parents had told him was happening to the British Empire.
yeah,
At the end of it,
Right.
during World War II and at the end, he said there's this kind of chaotic feeling that goes fin de cycle, you know, this kind of end of an era is happening, and all the things that you thought were normal before just aren't even there anymore. And so I think that that's beginning to dawn on some people in Washington, that they just simply, that the end of the era where they could just simply pick up and go and do things whenever they wanted to do, bomb whoever they want to bomb, take over whoever's resources they want to take. It's really become, they have no cover for it any longer. I know Trump is doing that in Syria with the area that they're controlling. They're basically, they brought some American oil company in to pump the oil out of Syria. I mean,
they just get away
they
with
just
it.
brought it in. It's completely, it breaks every law in the
Right.
book,
Well,
international
this
law,
is, I
anybody's
think,
law.
Yeah, this is, I think, certainly the point, I think,
Yeah.
about this particular question, though, I would like to add. First of all, Afghanistan right now is a very broken country. So if everyone left that, you know, that is an outsider, you're still dealing with a completely corrupted architecture of the Afghans that are left. The Taliban was actually a creation of Pakistani intelligence, okay? And even though there are real Afghans, just like Khalilzad, Zalmay Khalilzad is a real Afghan, but he does not represent the Afghan people. I think that's the point. And there may be Taliban that do actually have a genuine Afghan focus, but basically they're backed by the Pakistani intelligence. So, you know, you've got these issues that leave the poor Afghan people so vulnerable. And we know what happened to Afghanistan when the Soviets left, and the Mujahideen literally were the ones who destroyed Kabul was not destroyed by the Soviets. They were destroyed by the Mujahideen fighting with the Taliban, the Mujahideen fighting with each other, and then the Taliban coming in, sweeping in and simply taking over. So they were all just warlords, and they killed 50,000, something like 50,000 Afghans in this battle. They could have cared less about the people. So that's my concern, that this idea of what might happen if we just leave, it still is not going to solve the Afghan people's problem, that's for sure. But
can we solve that? I mean, this is the point. Can we solve that? I mean, I go back to—
I'm not, no, but we know that proper help, when you have destroyed a country, and I think the US does have a actual moral responsibility. When I said about what Brzezinski did was—
That's the question. Here's the question. Do we have a world responsibility?
Well, in the sense that Brzezinski did in fact cause the death of Afghanistan by luring the Soviets in, guaranteeing that they were then kept there, creating this whole, the force that became known as the Mujahideen, the freedom fighters. They were all basically being trained in Pakistan, and the Saudis were very involved in it, the Wahhabism and all that, okay, to completely undermine the fundamental organic way Afghanistan actually matured as a country. So it isn't, well, it's like you've just, the infrastructure.
Our feeling is that we do have, as Americans, we have a moral responsibility to the Afghan people. Whether we can fulfill that, I think that we can't. I don't see how that can be fulfilled.
I think
we're left with a conundrum.
No, I mean, but look, it has to do with basically the resources that have been invested in Afghanistan over the last 20 years have nothing to do with the people. I think that's the point that we have to accept. We're now seeing the effect of this horrible, unreal war economy on America. Finally, it's finally dawning, I guess, on a lot of Americans that right now, as Wall Street goes up, the American economy, the Main Street, the thing that we were supposed to be reinvesting in with the SALT Treaty and with détente back in 1977, when Jimmy Carter got elected, never happened because of Brzezinski's success at luring the Soviets in.
Exactly.
Once they lured them in, they held them down there, and then that became the casus belli for the neocon agenda to become totally invested. And this is what we are suffering from now.
So the neocons won.
Yeah.
Instead of dealing with what we got into, what the United States got into in Vietnam, instead of fixing that problem and dealing with the nature of the system that created a Vietnam, they decided to give the Russians their Vietnam instead. And so then declared victory and vindication after the Russians went in and did it. And that's why that little issue about whether they intentionally lured them in and tricked them into doing it
is really important.
It's why it's so sensitive to them, because they want to show that the Russians did it as a naked act of aggression, when in fact they were tricked into doing it.
And
wanted to get out very quickly. And we found that out personally.
But I really want this to be understood. There is absolute evidence the Soviets never would have gone in. So this is absolutely one of Brzezinski's whole claims, that he didn't really do anything because the Soviets were going to expand in there anyway, is false. So this is part of the problem in terms, I think my point to you, Marilyn, would be that this is part of the real responsibility, but how we fix that clearly is not militarily. There has to be a completely other way of approaching the world. And ironically, that was what was amazing about Brzezinski's speech in 2016, where he actually stated that. He said, we have to move away from the use of imperial power. We have to develop something, something non-imperial. And of course, he's referring then to.
I think, Rick,
30 years later, we've wasted a lot of.
Marilyn, I think we need to wrap up now. I think we need to move on to the regular meeting. I want to thank our guests very much, Paul and Liz. You've given us a tremendous amount of food for thought.
Thank you.
And for having us once again.
We enjoyed it. Thank you.
And read your books.
And we have lots of articles too.
We have lots of articles.
So what we have are articles that we've done in the last 10 years.
So thank you all once again. Thank you, Rick, for inviting us, and thank you all, and be safe and secure out there.